исследований Горно-Алтайского университета. Профессор Майкльсон у нас уже не первый раз. Он был на Алтае много лет назад и, по его словам, с удовольствием вернулся еще раз. Мы теперь вернулся не только в качестве гостя, а в качестве лектора. Профессор Майкльсон прекрасно говорит по-русски, поэтому студентам, особенно в филологического отделения, пожалуйста, ребят, не стесняйтесь, задавайте вопросы, даже если не в состоянии задать вопросы на английский, по-английски спрашивайте по-русски. Язык лекции будет английский и русский, но сегодня большая часть лекции будет проходить на английском. Поэтому такие вопросы, пожалуйста, можете останавливать в процессе лекции и задавать вопросы по ходу. Ну, все же устраивают, да, что по-английски? Конечно, все устраивают. Пожалуйста, перевод наш. Там есть стих по-русски, по-английски. То есть идет речь о переводе.
Так. Уважаемые господа студенты и преподаватели Горно-Алтайского государственного университета. Если вы пришли на нашу встречу в ожидании того, что вы обязательно услышите живую устную речь настоящего носителя американского варианта англо-корейского английского языка, к сожалению, на данный момент я не могу уверить вас, что вы будете удовлетворены. Почему? Да, потому что сегодня рано утром завершился во мне, в моей душе, какой-то странный процесс превращения меня во что-то почти неузнаваемое. В чем тут дело? Дело в том, что в Санкт-Петербурге в субботу вечером по московскому времени я сел в самолет на Новосибирск. Летел спокойно в окружении одних только сибиряков со светлыми лицами. И там совсем не пахло жульничество или какой-нибудь опасностью для меня. Я был настолько спокоен в этом самолете, что я тут же уснул, спал всю дорогу, около 5 часов, ни с кем не разговаривая. Ну, прилетел в аэропорт Томачева или Томачева, я не знаю, Томачева, спасибо, где была длинная пересадка, почти 5 часов. Выпил чашку кофе и остался сидеть за столиком кафе под американскую предрождественскую музыку. Работал над одним из моих выступлений. Ну, я отнесся немножко двойственно к этой американской предрождественской музыке, потому что такая музыка, если честно сказать, мне не очень нравится. И потому что у нас в Америке такая музыка раздается примерно в течение месяца, по крайней мере, до Рождества. И я не ожидал, что это то же самое я услышу и в России. Это не литургическая музыка, это вот такая популяр-попса, популярная рождественская музыка. Но, по крайней мере, под эту музыку я почувствовал себя более-менее нормально, без всякой российской экзотики. Перед посадкой на симпатичный самолетик Антонов-24, годности приблизительно 40 лет, на Горно-Алтайск вместе с 4 еще пассажирами. Я разговорился с одним из них, молодой человек, который занимается доставкой мяса с одного места на другое. А тут я ошибся, мы еще ждали посадки. Тут я ошибся, потому что я его спросил, не из Новосибирска это в республику Алтай он доставляет мясо. И он исправил меня и сказал с удовлетворением, что это наоборот. Что Алтай снабжает Новосибирск мясом. Видать, даже под мой допрос, значит, он уточнил, что это за мясо. Ну, морал. Замечательно. Вкусно ли это мясо или нет? Он сказал, как, кому. Так. Значит, рассказ продолжается. Я еще полностью американец со своим английским языком. Но, во-первых, в вашем аэропорту, новом вашем аэропорту встречает меня очаровательная женщина, красивая, умная и так далее. Она причем прекрасно говорит по-английски. Значит, мое чувство, что я еще в своей тарелке, так сказать, продолжаю. И она привезла меня с помощью шофера, естественно, в город и поселила, значит, в вашем общежитии номер 1. Ну, хорошо. Значит, передо мною, целых полсуток для того, чтобы я отдохнул, купил какие-то продукты в супермаркете, поел и так далее, посмотрел телевизор и отоспался, слава Богу. А рано утром, честно, я не ждал гостей, потому что кто еще знает, где я живу, кто я такой и так далее. А я иду принимать душ. Слава Богу, я еще в пижаме и в туфлях, то есть тапочка. Стук в дверь. Стук откуда? И сначала я подумал, что это не ко мне стучат. Это на доме даже выше. Да, нет. Не тут-то было. Стук продолжается. Ну ладно, я подошел в своей пижаме и в туфлях этой двери, и я слышу очень приятный женский голос. И эта женщина называет меня по имени, правильно. И что я еще могу в этой ситуации сделать? Я открыл ей, и опять же другая красавица, сибирская женщина, значит, опять же с прекрасным английским языком. Я пригласил ее войти, и она заявляет, что она пришла для того, чтобы забрать у меня паспорт. Мария, я вас сейчас искал. А это не Мария Саня, это была другая. Но, честно говоря, если за этим милым женским голосом стоял какой-то мужик, я бы ударил его в лоб. И обязательно выгнал бы его из своих хоромов. Но, конечно, поскольку это была женщина, я ничего подобного, я немножко стал нервничать, но я отыскал паспорт с визами и так далее, и отдал. И поверив, значит, что это все в порядке. Но, одним словом, это случилось сегодня утром. Я еще еле-еле так худо-бедно мог, значит, отвечать по-английски на ее вопросы. Но тут же, после того, как она ушла, я совершенно онемел. Я больше не мог говорить, совсем не мог говорить по-английски. И поэтому я сегодня пришел сюда, и меня смущает то, что, дай Бог, я помню сейчас через некоторое время переключусь на английский язык. Но мне показалось тогда, что я, как своя землячка из Канзаса, Алиса, помните ее, что я попал в страну чудес. Какая погода, какие горы, какой пейзаж, какие люди. Вчера в супермаркете, например, я не стеснялся спрашивать людей, сибиряков, значит, алтайцев и так далее, разбираетесь ли вы в этих сибирских водках или нет? Я хочу купить самую лучшую сибирскую водку. И молодой человек со своей семьей сказал, вот это надо, вот то-то это, вот это. То же самое, значит, с соками. И причем я послушал совет еще одного вашего земляка и купил не такие заморские фрукты, а я купил, значит, такой очень вкусный сладкий фрукт, вот, оранжевого цвета, который называется, напомните мне, курма. Это замечательный фрукт, курма. И еще вот из сухих фруктов, значит, которые привозят из Таджикистана, тоже на букву Х или К, курага. Ну, господа, вот я поел вот и курагу, и курму. И такое чувство я приобрел сразу, что я действительно, я не только попал в страну чудес, но я превратился во что-то совершенно другое. Понимаете? Я думаю, никакой англоязычный там и так далее. Ничего не осталось от этого. Ну ладно, но я предупреждаю вас, что у меня такое впечатление, что поев вот эту курму, ну это хорошо, наверное, вам понравится это услышать, что я не буду хмуриться у вас, потому что целую неделю я не буду хмуриться. Но то, что я вот это курагу поел, курагу, я курагу поел. Что я буду делать? Не только не хмуриться, но я буду куражиться. Предупреждаю и женщин, и мужчин. Хорошо. Да. Ну хорошо, ну теперь, конечно, шутки в сторону, потому что у нас время ограничено, и я переключусь на английский язык, хорошо. I would like to express a very sincere and very strong word of thanks to the rector of your university, Dr. Валерий Геннадьевич Babin, for agreeing to receive me as an official guest of the Горно-Алтайский State University, and to your director of international programs, Natalia Alexandrovna Yurkova, for asking for his permission and for making it possible for me to pay my second visit to one of the most beautiful and spectacular corners of our wonderful blue planet, Earth, namely the Altai Republic. My first visit here took place almost exactly or slightly more than 10 years ago, when my official host was your former Director of International Programs and Dean of Foreign Languages Faculty, Viktor Nikolaevich Lukyanenko, who unfortunately, he was a very close friend of mine and he died a few years ago. And I would also like to thank you, students and faculty members, for coming today, and perhaps you will come to hear me again tomorrow when I will talk about Pushkin's poem, Prorok, the Prophet, in Russian only, with maybe a little bit of English here and there. And on Thursday, when I will talk again about translation, only that time I will talk both in Russian and in English, I suspect, about a specific author, a specific poet, and a specific set of poems, and that is the poems of Yuri Zhivago from the novel Dr. Zhivago. That's one of my most recent works, which is called, it will be published in Moscow in a few months, in a collection of articles about Pasternak, which came out of the conference that I attended in May 2010, celebrating the 120th anniversary of the birth of Boris Leonidovich Pasternak. And my article is called Английский переводы стихотворения Юрия Жевалова. So I will use that as the basis for my third lecture on Thursday afternoon. I can already see, just by looking at your faces and sensing your reaction to what I've said so far, it is not only a wonderfully large audience here today, but also very eager to consider with me the very important activity of poetic translation, poetический перевод. In this audience, there are, as you may already have gathered, some old friends of mine, and I'm very happy to see both Maria Stanina and Albina Kravchenko here, as well as Natalia Yurkova. I have other friends here too, whom I look forward to seeing in the next few days. If we had more time together, I would go into great length to describe the powerful emotions that I felt during my first 24 hours here, but I've already done a little bit of that. But I'll repeat again the things that impressed me the most. First of all, you have to understand that neither in Kansas, where I teach, neither in Wisconsin, where I am from, where I was born, nor in St. Petersburg, where I'm living now for 3 months, are there any mountains. There are no mountains. Okay? So the first thing I saw from my wonderful Antonov 24 was the mountains. And then I saw something also which I love very much because I'm a northerner. I come from a northern state, Wisconsin, near the Canadian border, Great Lakes area. I saw snow, because when I left Kansas, there was no snow. And there's no snow in St. Petersburg now either. But there is snow in the Altai Republic and in Gorno-Алтайский. Another wonderful sign. You see, my spirits are rising almost every moment. And then, as I said, at the supermarket and on the street, I even asked directions through the gate of one of your government buildings of a policeman who was standing there. I asked him, I said, I think I may have gotten lost with these 2 bags of groceries. Can you tell me if I'm headed in the direction of Общежитие номер 1 on Choros Gurkin Street? And he said, no, you're going in the opposite direction. So he said, turn around and go this way, and you'll find your way back home. Very friendly. He could have just scowled at me and said, а мне какое дело? Or something like that. He came up to the gate and he actually gave me good, reliable assistance. So the third thing that I was extremely happy about is the friendliness of your people acted to me as a stranger. But you and I have business to conduct, so let's get to that business now. And that business is what we have in common, I assume. First of all, we have in common, all of us here, that we are simultaneous inhabitants of Mother Earth. Each of us is a literate native speaker of some great world language. In a certain sense, all world languages are great languages. I don't distinguish between Chinese, for example, which has the most speakers on this planet of any language, and the language of the Cherokee American Indians or Native Americans. I think all of these are great languages. It's just that some have more speakers and others have fewer speakers. And I, along with you and just about everyone who thinks about these matters, laments the gradual disappearance of some of the languages of smaller peoples. Okay, we hope that these can be preserved and restored, and that there will be more and more speakers of them. But each one of us here today is a native speaker of at least one language, and maybe even two. Some of you, I'm sure, are actually native speakers of two. You are bilingual or perhaps even trilingual, because you've been studying English for quite a long time. Now, this bilinguality or trilinguality that we are talking about is not only a significant factor in our individual character, a set of skills that gives us an advantage over other people who are, in this respect, not so fortunate as we are, but it also places a special responsibility on our shoulders when we know two or more languages very well. What is that responsibility? Each of us has not only a chance to add to our CV, our curriculum vitae, Галочки, okay, Russian, Altai, English, and so on. If that were all we could do, then I'm not sure it would be worth the effort. But it also means something which is far more important than that. Far more important than a list or a set of our professional qualifications, or the opportunity to gain an advantage over our fellow creatures to get ahead in a competitive dog-eat-dog competition for status and money out there in a cold, cold world. This what we call a cold, cold world. I'm not sure that can be literally translated into Russian, but my daughter is feeling the pinch. In her generation, she's now 25 years old. I mentioned that she has been here in this country several times when she was growing up, and she graduated from a Russian high school in St. Petersburg when she was 17 in 2003, and then she came back to the United States with me and my wife, her mother, and she finished American high school in 2004. And then she went on to study at Columbia University in New York City. Barnard College is a part of Columbia University. She majored in South Asian and Middle Eastern languages, and now she is a graduate student at the University of Chicago studying for a doctorate, and she'll be there for 4 or 5 more years studying for a PhD in South Asian and Middle Eastern languages and cultures. Her primary interest is ancient Persian poetry. And she also is interested in translation, and she's able to read the Quran in the original Arabic, and she is able to read the Persian poetry now with ease and even to translate it. So, but the cold, cold world has affected very strongly her generation, because it is no longer guaranteed when you are 23 or 24 or 25 years old that when you graduate from the university or from college with a degree that you can get a job in that field, in that profession. We have a big problem with unemployment right now. We hope it will be temporary unemployment for the generation of my daughter. It's a part of it's an effect of the economic crisis that has spread all the way around the world. let me get back to the main point that I was trying to make. Each of us who can legitimately claim that he or she is a bilingual, is bilingual, to some degree at least, has a responsibility, I would say even an ethical responsibility, to use these language skills not just for your own selfish purposes, but for the benefit of other people, for the benefit of our fellow man and woman, so to speak. For we are not machines. We are not verbal automatons once we know two or more languages. Each of us who translates from one language to another is also an ambassador. An ambassador representing one culture to another culture. Representing, okay? But it's a double act. That's a very serious matter, okay? To represent one culture to another culture. And we are also mediators between these two cultures. Now, in Russian, I call this mediation посредничество. Мы посредники между двумя культурами. And the goals, our goals should be not winning out in some kind of dog-eat-dog competition with another person, but it should be cooperating in concrete projects, exchanges between universities, and I'm very happy to be at the Gorno-Алтайский University because you have many exchange programs with American universities, not just with Kansas State University and with my University of Kansas, but also with Ozarka College in Arkansas, recently established a small exchange program with that college. And one of the leaders of that exchange program there is a prepodavatel whose name is John Van Orman. And he is not only a very close personal friend of mine, but he's also a former student of mine, graduate student. He received a master's degree in Russian and East European and Eurasian studies about 3 years ago from my university. So, you know all about this, how important these exchange programs are. So this is the kind of thing that we should be doing as ambassadors and as mediators, and you do extremely well. And to the extent that my university has been involved in cooperative projects with Gorno-Алтайский University for a number of years, we are very proud of this, and we think that that's perhaps one of the most important activities in which we engage. So, now this mediation, as I said, I call посредничество между двумя культурами, and this engagement in concrete exchange projects and so on, I call сотрудничество. But there's still another goal, I think, which goes beyond this посредничество and сотрудничество, and that's the one that I call, that's the one that involves us as individual human beings, whether you are Altaians or whether you are Americans, and that is what I call convergence. It can be called сближение, if it's more of a personal thing, or it can be called содружество, if it involves both people and goals and values and so on. In other words, it's kind of 3 stages here. You have this посредничество, как посол, как послы друг к другу. You have the next step upward is сотрудничество по конкретным проектам, говорят сейчас. And higher up you have сближение на уровне личных отношений между людьми. And then you have what I think is at least as high as this сближение and maybe even more important, and that is содружество. I love this word содружество, even though I know it's sometimes misused and misapplied, but it has to do with nations who are not really friends, but they get together in what they call a содружество. Do I make my point? Okay. Sometimes nations get together and they call it like an alliance, содружество, альянс, союзничество. I'm talking about содружество in a slightly more abstract and slightly more philosophical and slightly more honest and authentic sense of the word. Okay? Now, translation, перевод, is not only an extremely important activity, and I don't need to prove this to any of you, or even use any examples, but it is also a challenge, a вызов, and it's a difficult task, especially poetic translation. Poetic translation, as any other kind of translation, is not only a process, but it is also, its aim is to produce a result. Process and result. It works in both languages. Translation can be a process, just like перевод can be a process. Translation can also be a book or an article or a poem. In other words, the result of that process, of that activity. And it works both in English with translation and with перевод. Okay, they have two meanings, which are quite distinct from one another, but one cannot get along without the other. Okay? One is supposed to lead to the other. Now, a word of warning to those of you who have not personally engaged in the activity or the process of poetic translation. It's not only a challenge, it's not only a difficult task, but the result of poetic translation is never, never perfect. Never perfect. There is no perfection in our world, and probably never has been any perfection in the history of this planet and of humanity, except maybe for one Иисус Христос, может быть, или кто-то другой из божеств. Okay, so it is impossible, I suggest, to achieve perfection in poetic translation. In other words, I have just provided a tentative answer, предварительный ответ, to the question raised in the subtitle of my talk. Can Russian poetry be translated into English? Можно ли перевести русскую поэзию на английский? At the end of my talk, at the end of our meeting today, either here or by email, and I will make sure all of you have my email address before I leave, I hope you will help me to arrive at a more definitive answer to this question. That's why I've left the conclusion open in my outline for my talk today. As for now, my tentative answer to the question is нет. Конечно, нет. Перевести русскую поэзию на английский язык нельзя, невозможно. But, and as we say in Russian, no, no. And this is an important no. It is essential to try, nevertheless, to translate Russian poetry into English. Стараться перевести или просто переводить русскую поэзию на английский надо, нужно, даже необходимо. Okay, we are now moving to the stage here where we are going to look at specific examples of poetry in translation, and I'm going to move beyond the introduction finally to my talk and ask you to use the image that you have on the screen here, and I'll try to do this as efficiently as possible. The first time that I got involved with the activity of translating poetry was about 12 or 14 years ago. I was in St. Petersburg at the time. I was actually teaching a course at St. Petersburg University. I taught there 4 times, incidentally, in 2 different departments. One is the Russian literature department, where even as far back as the spring semester of 1993, which is 18 years ago, when most of you in this room were about this high. I was asked to teach a course on in the Russian literature department at St. Petersburg University. This request frightened me to death, almost. My first response was, what can I possibly say to these students about Pushkin that they don't already know from their own professors? Well, the chairman of the Russian literature department was a very nice man. His name was Askol Borisovich Muratov, and his colleague, who was also quite a famous scholar of Russian literature, Vladimir Markovich Markovich, they insisted that I do this. Muratov even insisted that I give an occasional lecture in English, because these lovatriase, these students of ours, who think they know English, they need to have you giving them occasional lectures in English. And they also need to see what the American method of teaching is. So please don't lecture for an hour and a half, but leave some time at the end for discussion. Well, that was 1993, and I tried that, and it didn't work. Why didn't it work? For two reasons. Number one, these lovatriase did not know English well enough. Now, as you know English well, see, there's been a revolution in your country. Your generation knows English. You know English extremely well. But your much older brothers and sisters and your parents did not know English very well. Okay? And the second reason was that the Russian students at St. Petersburg University had never been given the opportunity to ask questions and to discuss the material of the lecture. And so when I gave them 15 or 20 minutes at the end, I molchali. They were absolutely silent. Nobody wanted to ask any questions. Maybe one, in fact, one or two. And there were so few questions that I still to this day remember exactly who asked those questions. And one guy has not only gone on to get a PhD, but he also teaches Russian literature at the University of California in Los Angeles. He was a student at that time in 1993, and he asked questions. But I had to report to Askol Borisovich Muratov that it's too early yet. So he said, all right, go ahead and lecture in Russian only and lecture until the bell rings. And so I did that, and all the rest of the week I sat down and prepared these lectures, word for word, because it was the first time that I ever had such an assignment. So when I was doing that, incidentally I taught, when I got involved with the business of translation of poetry, I was also teaching at St. Petersburg University, but that time I was teaching in the Department of English Philology and Translation. And they asked me to give a course on literary translation, which we call художественный перевод, in English to some advanced level students. So I did that. Anyway, they had a conference. There is a Center for Translation Studies, which is now called Institute for Translation Studies, Институт устного и письменного переводоведения Санкт-Петербургского университета. The head of which is a friend of mine. His name is Viktor Ivanovich Shadlin. And they don't do this anymore, but at that time they had, every year or every other year, they had what they call Fyodorovsky Chteniya. The center is named after a very famous scholar whose name was Fyodorov. And I wrote an article for that conference, and it was published later in their proceedings, which was called, in Russian, it was written in Russian, it was called «Переводимо ли чувство юмора?» Is humor translatable? And I used as my example 3 translations of Russian poems that I had made myself. And you have them now here in front of you. And this is, if you wish, and this is on the board here, but as I told you, I was going to give you my email address before I leave, and if any of you wants to have a copy of this, I will send it to you by attachment, okay? The first one was Ivan Krylov's fable, okay? The Swan, the Crawfish, and the Pike. Lebedь, щука. So let's start with that then. Now, if you think this was easy, you're wrong. It wasn't easy because I was just beginning at that time to translate poetry. I'd been teaching Russian poetry, but that's a completely different thing. Это две большие разницы, как говорят в Одессе. Две большие разницы. Преподавать русскую поэзию и переводить русскую поэзию. But anyway, this was the result. Again, you will find it to be highly imperfect, but let me read it for you. Сначала в оригинале. Лебедь, рак и щука. Когда в товарищах согласия нет, на лад их дело не пойдет. И выйдет из него не дело, только мука. Однажды лебедь, рак и щука вести из поклажей воз взялись, и вместе трое всех в него впряглись. Из кожи лезут вон, а возу все нет ходу. Поклажа бы для них казалась легка, да лебедь рвется в облака, рак пятится назад, а щука тянет воду. Кто виноват из них, кто прав, судить не нам, да только воз и ныне там. The main reason why I chose this fable of Kryllov's is because at that time, in 1992, 93, my department at the University of Kansas was like that. It was coming apart at the seams, and we had at least 3 parties within our department, and we were all chewing each other to pieces. Gryzli drug drug. So I read this, first of all, my translation of this, at a departmental function, at a holiday celebration. And I'm sure that the members of these other parties, I was in one party, I was actually a party all by myself at that time, and maybe 1 or 2 other people, and then there were 2 other parties. I'm sure that the members of these other parties understood perfectly well what I was trying to say, okay? Кто лебедь, кто рак, кто щука. But they didn't say anything. They were deeply offended, I imagine, and I didn't say anything about why I translated this poem. Anyway, this is how it came out. The swan, the crawfish, and the pike. When tried consent of colleagues doesn't gel, their business surely goes to hell, and what you'll see is only torment at the office. There was a swan, a pike, and crawfish resolved to pull a loaded cart, and so each one was hitched to do its part. They busted ass, but still the wagon hardly lungeth. For them the load would seem not heavy, rather light, but swan up towards the clouds with flight. The crawfish shrinketh back, the pike to water plungeth. Who is to blame? Who's right? It's not for us to judge, but still the wagon doesn't budge. Okay, now there were 2 other examples that I used in that first article on переводимое чувство юмора. The second one became somewhat controversial. Why? Because some members in the audience, when they heard me read this poem in Russian and in my English translation, one of them raised her hand, and she was actually a docent in the Department of English Philology and Translation, and she said, господин Майкльсон, я не вижу никакого юмора в этом стихотворении. And it was, and we didn't get into a big argument about this, but I respect her opinion very much, so I started to think again about this matter. But as a matter of fact, I haven't changed my mind. I see humor in this. Maybe it's because of my age. I see humor in this. Конечно. I see humor in this poem. Okay, I'm sorry we didn't have the translation up here, please. Okay, there you have it. And I'll do that regularly from now on. Thank you, Natalia, for bringing me into the 21st century. It's hard for me to live in the 21st century. It's wonderful, believe me, because the alternative is quite grim. The alternative to living in the 21st century is quite grim. But this is the poem I'm speaking about. It may be the reason why I see humor in this, and somebody else much younger doesn't see humor in this, is because of my age. Okay? Because it's called Песня старика, an old man's song. And this interesting thing about this, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with with the wonderful Russian poet of the Pushkin age, whose name was Alexei Koltsov, from Voronezh. He was the only Russian poet of any note of Pushkin's generation who wasn't a member of the nobility. He was a son of a horse trader, Brasso. So he didn't have a fancy classical education like Pushkin and Denvig and Kukelbecker did at Imperatorский лицей в Царском селе. He didn't have that kind of education. But he was an extremely talented poet. And he was quite unlike any of the other poets of his generation. And also Pushkin loved his poetry because it was brilliant, ingenious poetry. And nobody else of the noblemen, like Martinsky or Языков or even Pushkin could write, or even Lebedь, who tried to write this kind of poetry and had some success. But none of them could write this kind of poetry like Koltsov. The rhythms of his poetry are completely different. Let me just read you four lines from another poem by Alexei Koltsov, which will illustrate this business about the rhythm. Now, the reason why I'm including this poem here is to demonstrate to you that trying to approximate the rhythm in a poem when you translate it from Russian to English may be the most important thing of all. It may be the most important thing of all, more important than semantics, more important than rhyme, or some other prosodic features. This is from four lines from a poem by Koltsov, which is called Koltsov. Песня. Я затеплю свечу воска ярого, распаляю кольцо друга милого. That's four lines. Typical lines of Koltsov from the standpoint of everything, especially the rhythm. So each of the poems that I'm showing you today I'm showing to you for a particular reason in order to show you what kind of particular problems I encountered and you would encounter if you were translating these poems. So, Песни старика. Incidentally, Alexei Koltsov wrote this poem when he was 21 years old. 21. How many of you are 21? Many of you are 21. You don't want to tell me your age, that's okay. He wrote this poem when he was 21, called Песни старика. Оседляю коня быстрого, я помчусь, полечу легче сокола, через поля, за моря, в дальнюю сторону, догоню, ворочу мою молодость, приберусь и явлюсь прежним молодцем, и приглянусь опять красным девицам. Но, увы, нет дорог к невозвратному, никогда не взойдет солнце запада. Everyone who is of a certain age dreams about having some kind of волшебница appear in his life. I didn't mention this, but I have had две алтайские волшебницы появлялись в моей жизни за последние сутки. Я говорил про них, правда? Вот почему я перестал смотреть на мир как американец. А как? Ну, наверное, как Алиса в «Стране чудес».
No, you read very beautifully the Russian writing.
Thank you.
There's a mistake in the first line, I'm terribly sorry. Оседлаю. It's not ya, but ah, that should be in the first word.
There's a mistake there.
Uh-huh.
Okay, you point this out to me after.
But you read well, you're majestic. It's very Russian.
I will saddle me steed, thank you for the observation. I will saddle me steed, me swift-footed steed. I will race, I will soar with the falcon's ease, o'er the fields, o'er the seas, to lands far away. I'll catch up, I'll bring back my old youthfulness. I'll be groomed and appear the old dashing self, and catch the eye once more of those fair maidens. But alas, there's no road to what's left behind. Don't expect from the west that the sun will rise. Okay, you can even apply the last 2 lines of this poem to global politics, I think, to Russian-American politics. Никогда не взойдет солнце запада, солнце с востока. Well, this is partly a joke, because I'm sure Kantzow had nothing such in mind, but at all, he had in mind something completely different. But of these 3 poems that I used as examples there, in that first article, in which I'm using as an example here for a slightly different reason, I must admit that the one I like best is the next one. The epigram number 3 of Kosmat Rutkov. I love Kosmat Rutkov. I love his aphorisms, like bzz. So, Natalia Yurkova knows already that I'm going to give you a couple of assignments today for Friday. A little bit later I'll give you a 4-line poem of a contemporary poet, Oleg Chukhontsov, which I would like you to translate from Russian into English and bring with you on Thursday. Even though it's about Pasternak, I want to see in writing, or just maybe you'll recite your translation. I haven't even started to translate this poem myself, but this is your first assignment, is how to translate the aphorism of Kosmat Rutkov. Don't do it now. Don't do it now. Okay, just think about it. Поразмыслите хорошо и переведете. И принесете. Четвертое. Договорились? Хорошо. I love this poem. Now, in order to understand 2 things in this, my translation of this poem, of this epigram number 3, you have to know, of course, who Diogenes was. Кто такой был Диоген? And in fact, there were 4 Diogenes in ancient Greek history, but only one of them is important for us today, and that's the one who lived in a barrel. Он жил в бочке. Это Диоген. Okay? He was a kind of a bomж. He was a homeless person. He had a barrel cave. And he was also a самостоятельно мыслящий человек. He was a free thinker. And he was almost always nearly naked. Он не считал важным одеваться, не только модно, но вообще. Он в лохмотье ходил. And once, this illustrates the character of the man and his free thinking. Once he was approached by Alexander the Great, Imperator Alexander Великий. And Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedonia, Alexander Makedonsky, asked him, Diogenes, what can I do for you? This is what our politicians are always asking us. What can we do for you, especially during election time, right? Чем я могу быть вам полезным? Чем я могу вам служить? Александр Македонский спрашивал Диогена. Диоген поразмыслил и сказал, what you can do for me is step over there a little bit because the sun is shining and you are blocking the sun from my view and it's the only way that I can warm up today. Я смогу погреться лишь если лучи солнца, значит, падают на меня. А вы заслоняете их. Значит, Александр Македонский, отойди немножко, пожалуйста. Вот такой человек, Диоген, это. The second thing that you must know, there are 3 things actually. The second thing, the most difficulty that I had in translating this poem was with the image and the word bochka. I couldn't find a suitable rhyme for bochka. You know that this is based upon a Russian proverb also. Твоя голова пустая бочка. Or твоя башка пустая бочка. Something like that. Based upon a proverb. But since I couldn't find a suitable translation for bochka, I decided to use a lecture instead. Правда, бочка округленная. А вот этот, this lecture, вот это как по-русски называется? Кафедра квадратная, да? Но все равно есть какая-то пустота внутри. В принципе, можно было бы, как любому из нас, там жить. Как жил Диоген в Очи. Хорошо? And it turned out to be easier for me to find a word to rhyme with using the image of the lectern rather than the image of the barrel. And the rest of it is perfectly clear, I think. So, эпиграмма номер 3. Козьма Прудков. Пия душистый сок цветочков, пчела дает нам мед взамен. Хотя твой лоб пустая бочка, но все же ты не Диоген. There's one other thing I should mention here. The word ain't, as I'm sure you know, is a substandard word in English. We tell our children, don't say ain't. All of our children say ain't. They learn it from their friends. But there are some occasions and some contexts in which even highly educated, refined, sophisticated people like Kazamatsov use the word ain't, okay, for special effect. And here I use it too because I can easily imagine Kazamatsov doing something like that. Because he was really a very smart guy. Epigram number 3. By savoring the blossom's nectar, the bee provides us mead exchange. Mead is milk. Although your brow's an empty lectern, Diogenes, my friend, you ain't. So if you have a friend, young ladies, if you have a boyfriend who thinks he's really smart, you know, really smart guy, you can say to him, no, все же ты не Диоген. If you want to say this in English, you can say, Diogenes, my friend, you ain't. Okay. The next thing that incidentally, I'd like to repeat what Natalia Vyurkova said, and I'm happy that the gentleman back there pointed out the mistake in my Russian text there. Please feel free to ask questions to stop me getting bored. But the next example that I'd like to use is, strangely enough, an example of a translation from English into Russian, which was done by a man who I think is, in my opinion, this is a matter of taste, of course, the finest living Russian poet today, Oleg Grigorievich Chukhonzev, Moskovsky poet. Early in his career, back in the 1960s, late 60s and early 70s, when he had trouble publishing his own original poetry, he translated a lot of English language poetry, especially American poetry, into Russian. And here is what I think is a wonderful translation of his, one of the most famous poems in all the history of American poetry, by Robert Frost. Danny, you'll appreciate this because you're from New England, especially, okay? The scenery in this poem is definitely New England winter scenery, okay? Not much different maybe than the Altai Republic, because there are mountains in New England, okay? Anyway, this is what Robert Frost's poem sounds like in the original. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. It looks like a simple poem, but it is not. It's a very profound and deep poem. So this is what Oleg Chukhonzev did in that poem. Зимним вечером у лес. Чей это лес и эти дали? Хозяин этих мест едва ли, к чему мы здесь у кромки заснеженного поля стали. И непонятно лошаденки, зачем мы здесь ночной поземке стоим, где пасмурные ели глядятся в белые потеки. Звеня уздечкой еле-еле, мол, что такое самом деле она все ждет, пока седок прислушивается к метели. Прекрасен лес, дремуч, глубок, но должен я вернуться в срок, и путь до дома еще далек, и путь до дома еще далек. At the bottom of this page, you will see my second assignment for you, besides translating into English Kazmat Rukhos B'ti. This is a 4-line poem, which I have not even started to translate myself, written by Oleg Chukhonsev in 1969. So, please bring this along on Thursday, your translation, okay, into English. Мера такая, 2 на 3 ошибки. Время такое, на горно берет, ночью за окнами станет машина, дверцею хлоп, и душа упадет. Это без комментариев пока. In January of 1981, when the wonderful Russian prose writer of the late Soviet period and post-Soviet period, another person, writer with whom I was acquainted, Vasily Pavlovich Aksyonov, he was told to leave the Soviet Union by the Cultural Committee of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And he and his wife, Maya, left the Soviet Union with they thought would be permanently. They didn't come back until after the fall of the Soviet Union. He died just a couple of years ago. When he was my guest at the University of Kansas in January of 1981, he and his wife, they were on their way across the United States. They bought a used car in New York City, and they drove all the way across the United States to California, stopping in Kansas in the middle. And they stayed in a guest apartment at our University of Kansas, much like the one that I'm staying in now here in Горно-Алтайский. That's the old dome. And it was in a building, a small building called Nunemaker Hall. Nunemaker is the last name of the wealthy woman who had donated a couple of $1 million to construct this building with that apartment. And when it was time for me to take Vasily Pavlovich Aksyonov and his wife Maya back to the Kansas City International Airport, I asked him to write something in our Kniga Odzivov. He sat down with the pen and Kniga Odzivov and he wrote a poem in English. His English was always pretty good. If you've read any stories by Aksyonov, you know that way back in the early stages of his career, he was already including a lot of English words in his Russian writing. Anyway, this is what he wrote, and I'm going to read this with his wonderful Russian accent, because even though he knew English very well and could converse, he had a rather strong Russian accent. So this is how he would read that if he were doing it instead of me. He called himself a migrant writer, перелетный писатель. There is a man in avant-garde chair. He came from Eastern Hemisphere, no doubts, East or West. Nunemaker is best. That is international affair. Notice he left out the article before the word international here. In perfectly better English it would be, that is an international affair. But я простил ему все. Потому что я считаю, что это замечательный стих. It captures a lot of things. When I was teaching translation at St. Petersburg University a few years ago, I asked my students to translate this poem into Russian. And the two best translations were done by two women whose names are Yelena Rumyantseva and Yelena Petrova. And so I put them together here because you'll see that they are both wonderful translations, but they are also quite different from one another. And the first one goes like this. Хотя обойди весь мир кругом, Nunemaker, милый сердцу дом. Так утверждает некий бард, ударившийся в авангард. С востока он пришел и здесь друзей нашел. And Yelena Petrova, who is my colleague from the English philology and translation department there did this one. Позади океан Атлантический. Я в гостинице академической в авангардное кресло опустил свои чресла. Шаг поистине дипломатический. По стиле акционов перелетных писателей. Правда чудно? She is also, she's not just a professor who teaches translation, but she also is a well-known translator of contemporary American and Canadian prose into Russian. Елена Петрова. I am assuming that we have to strictly keep to the amount of time. We have 15 more minutes left, right? Today. Okay, I'll try to move ahead here rather rapidly then. And I think that I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff here, but let me just show you one more example of where there are two separate translations available. You will recognize this easily as an отрывок из письма Онегина к Татьяне из романа стиха Пушкина Евгения Онегина. Those of you who know the creative history of Evgeny Onegin will remember that the Pismo Onegina к Tatyane was the last thing that Pushkin wrote to make the canonical version of the novel complete. He wrote that in 1831, when everything else was already long since written. And the letter of Onegin to Tatyana is, of course, a masterpiece on its own. And one of the most powerful stanzas in this letter is the one that you see here, where Onegin is saying to Tatyana, as he pleads with her to, I suppose, run away from her husband, like Anna Karenina ran away from her husband later on in Russian literature, and run off with Onegin, because he has fallen head over heels in love with Tatyana. So he says in his last plea to her, "Я знаю, век уж мой измерен, но что продлилась жизнь моя, я утром должен быть уверен, что с вами днем увижусь я." Julian Henry Lowenfeld recently published an entire volume of Pushkin's poetry in English, his own English translation, under the title of Talisman, of the good luck charm. And his translation, and I can't seem to move it over where I want it there, but I'll read it to you anyway. You'll see most of it is here. Short spans I know, life's measured distance, yet to keep going and endure each morning I need reassurance. I'll see you in the afternoon. Frankly speaking, I thought I could perhaps do as well, or better maybe than Lowenfeld. It's up for you to decide who is кто судья здесь. But this was my translation. Though to be sure my days are shrinking, you can empower me to last each morning if I wake up thinking we'll meet before the day is past. I like that better. Маша. Спасибо. Один голос. I have to put in at least one of the things that I have on Pushkin here, because I love Pushkin more than any other Russian writer. I spend most of my time studying and writing about Pushkin's poetry, and especially since you've just had these wonderful Russian elections yesterday and results are coming out today and tomorrow. I'm following them very closely. Here you have two poems that Pushkin wrote about his wonderful relationship with the Emperor Alexander I, who sent him to the south, and who Pushkin and his generation, especially the Decembrists, let's say, were not terribly fond of. He was a great Russian hero, победитель в войне, это да. Потом, значит, он им не понравился. То есть политика его последних лет. Pushkin, in Evgeny Onegin, there is a so-called Desятая глава, 10th chapter, which is not a part of the canonical text. Only fragments of it are surviving, because it was about the Decembrists. Pushkin put it into a kind of code system, folding up papers very carefully and so on. But some lines survive. And these 4 lines are about Александр I. Властитель, слабый и лукавый. We have to think not just in terms of Alexander the First, because we didn't really know him like Pushkin did. We have to think about our own leaders, let's say. Maybe George Bush. George Bush. Notice I didn't say Barack Obama. I said George Bush, Jr. Властитель, слабый и лукавый, лишивый шоголь, враг труда. Нечаянно пригретой славой над нами царствовал тогда. An autocrat, both weak and scheming, a balding fop and foe of work, in days gone by with glory beaming, ruled over us by some strange quirk. Now, it wasn't enough for Pushkin to write these lines about Alexander I in the so-called 10th chapter of Onegin, but he also wrote a separate poem about Alexander I when he saw a bust of him that was made by a Danish sculptor whose name was Thorenfeld, I think. This is close to me because I am of Danish descent. And Pushkin noticed in this bust of Alexander, he noticed a contradiction between the eyes and the rest of the face, which he took as being a brilliant stroke of genius on the part of a sculptor, capturing this aspect of Alexander I. Бюсту завоевателя. Завоеватель — это еще герой, правда? Победитель Первой Отечественной войны над Наполеоном. Напрасно видишь ту ошибку. Рука искусства навела на мрамор этих уст улыбку и гнев на хладный лоск чела. Недаром лик сей двуязычен, таков и был сей властелин, к противочувствиям привычен в лице и в жизни Арлекин. To the bust of the conqueror, we see here truly not a garble, the sculptors chosen to endow the monarch with a smile of marble, but angers on his cold, gloss brow. Hypocrite to head the nation, such was the wearer of the crown, accustomed to dissimulation, in deeds and attitudes a clown. I think I'm going to skip ahead of this point because I noticed that we are running out of time, and I'm going to save this material, and it's going to be available to you if you want by email. These are more poems by Pushkin. Also, I've translated 2 poems by Fyodor Ivanovich Tyutchev from a series of poems which I like to call его петербургские стихотворения. He was in love with a young woman whose name was Denisova. But I'm going to skip that. But I can't resist the temptation to show you one more Pushkin poem here. This is from Ruslan and Lyudmila. And 2 excerpts from Ruslan and Lyudmila. You remember that Lyudmila was supposed to marry Ruslan and have the first night with him. Then she was kidnapped and she ended up out there somewhere and was approached and by Chernamur, this little monster who was about this high, stuck in the ground, and tried to seduce her. So this one excerpt is about the wedding night of Lyudmila, and the second one is about what she does to Chernamur. I feel sorry for Chernamur. Too bad. Так жаль, Chernamur. No, tough. Okay, so this is it. We have. Вы знаете, что наша дева была одета в эту ночь по обстоятельствам точь-в-точь, как наша прабабушка Ева. Наряд невинный и простой, наряд Амура и природы. Как жаль, что вышел он из моды. This is almost approaching what is called by us Pushkin scholars as задорная поэзия Pushkina. It's one of the reasons why his friends loved Ruslan and Lubila so much, and everybody who read this knew that there was a genius. What genius? Our Virgin Maid, you surely see, was rather thinly clad that night, owing to circumstances tight, just like our distaff forebear Eve. Attire so innocent and plain was Eros' too, and nature's code. How sad such dress is out of mode. You see, Diogenes dressed like this, and now we have Lyudmila dressing like this on her wedding night. But then the next one is about Черномор. Читатель, расскажу тебе, куда красавица девалась. Всю ночь она своей судьбе в слезах дивилась и смеялась. Ее пугала борода, но Черномор уж был известен и был смешон, а никогда со смехом ужас не совместен. Shall I, dear reader, now relate just whither fled my beauteous lass? All night she marveled at her fate, while shedding tears she also laughed. She cringed at his repulsive beard, and Черномор can't raise his girth. Он такой маленький, он не может вырасти выше. Can't raise his girth. He's laughable. Our worst of fears can never match a dose of mirth. Now here Pushkin is not only being humorous and ironical and wonderful, but he's also giving us good advice, which we can use as an aphorism in any time, in any place, right? Это афоризм на все времена и места. Никогда со смехом ужас не совместен. Our worst of fears can never match a dose of mirth. Правда ли? Молодые люди, имейте в виду. Хорошо. Вы много смеетесь, но когда вам станет трудно смеяться, вот вы это вспомните. Пушкинский афоризм. Хорошо? Now I'm going to skip all the way to near the end of this presentation because I want very much to pay tribute to two contemporary Russian poets who have died recently. I think that they will be remembered as perhaps the two best poets of their generation. This generation of the 1960s, шестидесятники и позже. This is Bulata Kujava and Bella Madulina. And each of them came to the University of Kansas as my guest. Bella came in the fall of 1977 with her husband Boris Nesarev and stayed for 5 days. And we traveled and laughed, and she read her poetry, and I tried to buy her a pair of jeans, but I couldn't find them jeans that fit because she had an extremely narrow waist and very wide hips. 2 hours we tried to buy jeans for her, and we didn't find a pair. And as a result, we lost the time that we were supposed to spend making a car trip to the Wild West, Дикий Запад. Вот поездки на Дикий Запад не состоялось из-за наших попыток найти более обновленные по ее размерам джинсы. Факт истории. I would like to pay tribute to her. It has been almost exactly 1 year since she died. Incidentally, there was a wonderful movie about her on television last week. Maybe some of you saw it. This is one stanza from one of her earliest poems, which was published in the last part of the 1950s. And I think that these 4 lines capture one of the qualities of Akhmadulina's verse, which made it great even then, and which gives a clue as to her greatness until the end of her life. She was born in 1937, the same age that many other great Russian writers were born, like Valentin Grigorovich Rasputin, Andrei Bitov, Bella Akhmadulina, Vladimir Makarin. This is a separate topic, which I'm planning to have a conference panel talk about the Russian writers who were born in 1937. But anyway, this was early Ахматова. I'm sorry. Меня влечет старинный слог. Есть обаяние древней речи. Она бывает наших слов, и современнее, и вещи. I'm drawn to older language ways. There's charm in antiquated speech. It oft exceeds the words we say in timeliness and poignancy. And then to Bulata Kuchava, who was born somewhat earlier in 1925 and fought in the Second World War as a young soldier, and he wrote about that a story called Будь здоров, как школяр, one of his first important prose works. Anyway, this is 4 lines from his famous poem, the story which is called Песня про дураков. I don't have a guitar with me today. If I did, I would ask somebody to play it. I don't play myself. So I can't sing, I don't remember exactly the melody. But I consider now Bulata Kuchava not just to be a great bard, авторской песни создатель, but I consider him to be an outstanding poet as well. And this is one stanza from his песни про дураков. Вот так и ведется на нашем веку, на каждый прилив по отливу, на каждого умного по дураку, все поровну, все справедливо. When I read that third line there, на каждого умного тут по дураку, I understand completely why most of our elections in the United States are so close. 50.5% for one, 49.5% for the other. На каждого умного по дураку. I'll leave it for you to guess which I consider to be umli and which I consider to be duraki. In our generation, we follow the rule: for every flood tide brings its sequel. For every intelligent man, there's a fool. It's all fair and square, and it's equal. Так, я закончил. Думаю, что если будут еще вопросы, то минуты 2 возьмем. Да. Я закончил на сегодня, хорошо. Мария.
Чтобы вы приготовились к четвергу, можете нам показать еще наше домашнее задание? 4 строчки не успели?
Я не успел? Я прошу извинения. Да, конечно, обязательно. Да. Вот я технически, Маша, я безграмотный.
But I also have a question.
Okay, but you see, Natalia is teaching me how to be more 21st century person. Maybe when I leave here, I'll be able to do this kind of stuff myself. Okay, here's the assignment. Yeah, this is very important. Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned that. So here we go. Too closer. Here it is. Мера такая. 2 на 3 аршина. Время такое на горло берет. Ночью за окнами станет машина. Дверцию хлоп. И душа упадет. 1969 год. You had a question also, Masha.
I have a question about Dr. Seuss.
Dr. Seuss?
Yeah.
It's not a translation from Russian.
But a month ago, I saw a bookstore, translated book of him, His Cat in Hat, translated Russian, was surprising. I wonder if you would challenge to translate Dr. Seuss into Russian, if you were Russian.
If I were Russian, I would love to do that. Oh, absolutely. Dr. Seuss, is обязательное чтение для всех наших детей. Okay? Our children grow up, they cut their teeth on Dr. Seuss. Okay? My sons who are now 45, 43 and 39, they still remember Dr. Seuss from their childhood. It's extremely important literature. Это не попса. Это классика. Don't you agree?
Yeah.
Of course. Just like Alice in Wonderland, and I suppose Harry Potter. Any other questions? Yes, please.
What's your favorite Russian poem?
Favorite Russian poem? I think I might be talking about that tomorrow with my lecture on Pushkin's Prorok, the Prophet. Я подумаю еще. I will still think about it some more, but at the moment at least I think Pushkin's Prorok is my favorite Russian poem. I also love many, many others. For example, Boris Pasternak. I love his poem from the Yuri Zhivago poems at the end of the novel, in the last chapter of the novel. I will show you on Thursday my translation of Hamlet, and my translation of another poem which you may want to have a look at in advance. It's not a religious poem, it's an erotic poem, эротическое. It's called Объяснение. I love especially Объяснение, and I'll show you my translation of that, and I'll explain why I love that poem so much. So these are perhaps two examples. But I also love Верный всадник, Евгений Онегин, любая строчка мне очень близка, every line from, you know, somebody asked once a bunch of people if they were destined to spend the rest of their lives on some kind of uninhabited island, необитаемый остров. What one book would you take along with you? And one very clever fellow, he said, after thinking about it, I'll take the complete works of Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy. 90 one book. I would say Evgeny Onegin. I
wonder, Onegin was translated into English by many.
Many.
What is the best translation? And I know one translation in Arnold.
Walter Arnold. Right.
What do you think about that?
In one or the other of my lectures this week, I would have mentioned it, because I have a whole file which compares and contrasts, shows you these translations. Every year I receive a new translation. Somebody translated it. I think there are at least 10 or 15. Walter Arndt, I knew Walter Arndt a little bit. He was a prominent Russian scholar. I think his translation is very good. I think it suffers a little bit from the fact that English was not his first language. German was his first language. Now I realize they're both Germanic languages and they have a lot in common, but just like, no, Walter Arndt could not pretend that he was a native speaker. I think the best one, from my point of view, is one that's done by a man named James Phelan, F-A-L-E-N. It's also not a recent one. It was done about 15 or 20 years ago. Actually, if you want to see what I have to say about this in a published article, I have an article that was written in Russian, I think. It was published in Tomsk, in some kind of not ученые записки, but some kind of сборник, about 5 years ago. And my article is called, it's about женские ножки, Evgeny Onegin. I take all the translations that I had access to at that time and see how they translated женские ножки into English. And it's fascinating, because some people translate женские ножки as ankles, some as feet, some as legs, some as limbs, конечности, ужасно, so on and so on. So I don't offer my own translation, but I offer some slightly humorous remarks about other people's translations. But you can find this article, I think it's called something like перевод фразу «женские ножки» Евгения Онегина. I'll see if I can find that for you if you want. But anyway, you're right that there are lots and lots of but I use this material, you see, Evgeny Onegin, in my course on theory and practice of translation. I can build the entire course around the various translations of Evgeny Onegin. Just as another deceased friend of mine, a wonderful writer and scholar, Pushkin scholar, Chekhov scholar, Alexander Pavlovich Chudakov, told us at one Pushkin conference 15 years ago that he has, for many years at the Literary Institute and various universities, been teaching an entire course consisting only of Evgeny Onegin. And he used that course to teach literature, to teach language, to teach history, to teach geography, to teach wheat, and so on. It's all there. And that's what makes Evgeny Onegin so fascinating. It's what makes Evgeny Onegin my favorite long work of Russian literature. And it's what makes many translators want to try out their mettle on this translation, cut their teeth or try. Some are amateurs, some are lawyers, some are doctors. They do this in their spare time, and it takes 25 years for them to produce one of my friends in England, whose name is Stanley Mitchell. He finished his translation of Evgeny Onegin about 3 years ago, and he sent me a copy of it, and I remember him saying 10 years before that he had already been working 20 years on this translation. So he worked 30 years on this translation. That's a very good one, Stanley Mitchell from England. He's a professor of art history at some British university. If there's time, maybe one more question if you like. Is there another question? Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. I hope you